Okay, let's begin. This is Tony Papert. I'm welcoming you to the second and last part of Dan Leach's class on Edgar Allan Poe within the LaRouche-Pak class series on America's Soul. Last week, Dan looked at Poe's life from a certain aspect and some of his stories. And tonight, Dan's going to discuss Poe's poetry, also his theory behind his poetry, for which Dan has tremendous qualifications, as I said last week, as a qualified published poet. But let me just say briefly, in introduction, that I just found out through the Axios two-part series, Inside Trump 25, that President Trump is very actively planning for his next presidential administration beginning in 2025. Particularly, he's into a process of selecting qualified staff, not just for the White House, but federal departments, given that the fact that his last administration was sabotaged from within, including by almost all of his appointees, was one of the reasons, along with the coup attempts against him, that kept him from accomplishing what he wanted. So his preparations for the next Trump administration had begun, and our preparations, those on this call, must also begin. Now, people on the call are doing a tremendous number of important things. They're fighting to take over the Republican Party as a party of producers in the tradition of Lincoln. They're fighting to guarantee the integrity of the vote in primaries in the next November election and in elections leading up to the next presidential 2024. But we must also prepare ourselves as citizens with the knowledge needed to run the country. And in fact, many on this call, I mean, everybody on this call, mostly will be the citizens, but many, in fact, will find themselves in levels of government, local, state, and also federal. Many of you, in fact, are running for office. But we're devoting ourselves in this class series to a kind of intellectual preparation. And in this case, for the tasks of citizenship and leading the country. And in this case, it's preparation through art with Poe, which it's a kind of play. I mean, in a way, it's a way of communicating ideas, which through play, as it were, or a play activity, which doesn't engender the uptightness of all other forms of communicating ideas. It's play as a child in play prepares itself, for himself or herself, for the role they will play as a grown-up man or woman later on. The play is the thing, as Shakespeare said in Hamlet. So with that introduction, let's listen to Dan Leach.
Oh, thank you, Tony. I hope that those who saw last week's presentation came away with at least a glimmer of the idea that Poe was communicating through his prose works. We looked at just a few of them, the detective stories, and what he himself had to say about what he was trying to accomplish with these stories. And I think the overarching idea that I hope people came away with is that Poe was making a very profound point about how the mind works, and that if you are trapped in modes of thinking that are either determined by pre-existing axioms, rules, as you are with Aristotelian thought, and you deduce things from those fixed rules, or if you are, on the other hand, a slave to your senses, you think that all knowledge is only what comes from the senses, and build up structures based on those patterns that you see from the senses, which is called in philosophy induction. And he makes riotous, hilarious fun of these two modes of thinking, calling them creeping and crawling, respectively, that you are essentially trapped. You're a mental slave to those who control the rules of knowledge, information, as we see today in the war going on over information and whatnot. But this pervades the education system today. Poe, on the other hand, was trying to free people's minds so that they could actually be the citizens of a free republic. That was his passion, and he did it in a certain way through his prose works by lifting the reader into this imaginary space where their mind is free from these preconceived kinds of patterns of thought and is able to directly experience the principle he's trying to get across. In the case of these two stories we looked at, it involves a creative leap, more than just intuition. It is the imagination, imagining the solution, and only in that state of the stimulation of the imagination is that able to happen. And he, in the case of the detective story we looked at, the purloined letter, it solves a crime. And I think I mentioned that Poe actually did solve a real crime through one of his stories. And in the second case, it involved the narrator or the storyteller saving his life through making this kind of creative leap. So that was what Poe was concerned with in many, many of his stories. Others do different kinds of things, but they are always talking about the principles of either the healthy human mind when it's creative, when it's being true to its actual nature, or the unhealthy mind, the diseased mind that we see in the criminal, in the oligarch, and Poe is just one of the most brilliant. He really anticipates modern psychology in a lot of important ways, as well as many, many other things that his stories exemplify. But tonight we're going to be looking at his poetry, where there's a slightly different principle involved. It's still the same theory about the mind, but in the case of poetry, we don't have to really surmise what Poe might have thought about it merely from his poems. He actually talked about it quite transparently and directly, and we'll get into this a little bit in the body of the discussion. He actually wrote, in addition to, I think, the 35, I may be mistaken, but it wasn't surely much more than that number of poems in his whole life. He and the few that he wrote are among them are 5 or 6 of the greatest masterpieces in writing in the English language, in my opinion. So, a bit like, as I said last week, like Beethoven, writing only one opera. If you're going to write only one, or if you're only going to write a few poems, he made it worthwhile. But he discusses what he was doing with these poems in 3. He discusses the subject of poetry in 3 separate essays that he published, that you can, one of which we provide a link for, I believe, with the announcement of this class. Those 3 are called the Poetic Principle, which concerns the overall philosophy of Poe, of what poetry aims at, what it is, what is great poetry, what is not. It is based on a lecture series that he did, which was very popular, was very well attended during his lifetime. And the second is called The Rationale of Verse, which concerns the mechanics, you might say, the technical aspects of how a poem is written, particularly rhyme, meter, and rhythm, what is known, what is called in the old school the music of poetry, because it is very much like the structure of music, the measures and the rhythm in music. Poetry, good poetry, has rhythm and meter. It doesn't always have rhyme, although that can aid. It also has other musical qualities, the vowel sounds and whatnot. And Poe discusses this at some length and really demystifies it, takes it out of the realm of just pedantry and and books, theoretical books, and makes it very accessible to anyone who's interested. And then the third one, which we're going to look at a little bit, I'll quote from the Poetic Principle in a minute, but we're also going to look in a little depth at his philosophy of composition, which is the third thing that he wrote on poetry itself. And this involves a really interesting paradox, which I hope you'll appreciate when we get around to that. So in the Poetic Principle, Poe makes a very interesting observation. He divides the human mind and its operations into three categories. The one is reason, intellect, by which we perceive or attain to or ascertain, you might say, truth. That's what the human mind the higher powers of the human mind can do, like no other creature. And he has some things to say about that. The second, and you might say that is the theater in which he's operating in his prose, and the method by which you can attain truth. The second, he says, is the moral sense, by which we ascertain what our duty is, what our moral, how we should act. And this, he gives a separate department of the mind, or a separate function, I should say. And the third is that part of the mind which it perceives, which perceives and which is capable of producing beauty, which he says is completely different than the other two. That one can think something is right, but that's not the same thing as thinking it's beautiful or true. That it is a unique quality of the human mind to be able to perceive order, to be able to perceive something that seems to come from beyond just the senses, and that this quality is the purview and the sole subject of poetry. It can be arrived at in many different ways, but that's what poetry and music. And he says that music, poetry, when it's allied with music, as in opera, or you think of the art songs of Schubert and other things like that, it can attain the highest impact and effect on the human soul. So he says that part of the human being which perceives beauty is the soul. And I think what I'll do at this point is a quote for you, just a little section, which will not only give you an idea of what he means by this, but also how beautifully he thought and wrote, which you got a little bit of a glimpse of last week. But this is a section after he's quoted a few poems in this lecture that he used to give, the Poetic Principle. He held forth on what his idea of poetry and its purposes were, and then he recited from memory 9 or 10 poems, some of them fairly long, of some of his contemporaries, American writers, a few English writers, all of which in different, sometimes wildly different ways, exemplified this principle that he's talking about, which you'll hear. So maybe you can put that up, Keisha. So he's recited a few poems, and then he has this passage. An immortal instinct deep within the spirit of man is thus plainly a sense of the beautiful. This it is which administers to his delight in the manifold forms and sounds and odors and sentiments amid which he exists. And just as the lily is repeated in the lake, or the eyes of the amaryllis in the mirror, so is the mere oral or written repetition of these forms or sounds or colors or odors and sentiments a duplicate source of delight. But this mere repetition is not poetry. He who shall simply sing with however glowing enthusiasm or with however vivid a truth of description of the sights and sounds and odors and colors and sentiments which greet him in common with all mankind, he, I say, has yet failed to prove his divine title. There is still something in the distance which he has been unable to attain. We have still a thirst unquenchable to a lie which he has not shown us the crystal springs. This thirst belongs to the immortality of man. It is at once a consequence and an indication of his perennial existence. It is the desire of the moth for the star. It is no mere appreciation of the beauty before us, but a wild effort to reach the beauty above, inspired by an ecstatic prescience of the glories beyond the grave. We struggle by multiform combinations among the things and thoughts of time to attain a portion of that loveliness whose very elements perhaps appertain to eternity alone. And thus, when poetry, or when by music, the most entrancing of the poetic moods, we find ourselves melted into tears, we weep then, not as the Abate Gravina supposes, through excess of pleasure, but through a certain petulant, impatient sorrow at our inability to grasp now, wholly, here on earth, at once and forever, those divine, rapturous joys of which, through the poem or through the music, we attain but a brief and indeterminate glimpses. So that's what Poe had to say in the Poetic Principle, and I think you get an idea of what he's, what I think is the essence of what he's saying about poetry. It has to do with the immortality of man, and I'll have a few things to say a little bit later about why I think that is culturally and politically the crux of the matter. Poe certainly did, and I think his collaborators, among other great American writers, as we saw in some of the previous classes, also agreed with this point. He goes on to say in the Poetic Principle that in this light, the worst sin one can commit in poetry is what's called didacticism. That means the attempt to preach directly or teach directly moral principles or truths, which are much better suited to prose. In fact, he says, if it can be written better in prose, write it in prose. Right? What poetry does is, through the imagination, touches the soul through its ability to convey this beauty. Here, once again, you might say, okay, well, that's fine. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China, as they say? But he was waging at the time a very pitched, polemical battle in the pages of the journals of the time and the newspapers of the time against those who disagreed with this. The pro-British school of what is known as the Transcendentalists, who did just that, among other things. which I'm not going to go into. But one of the things they did was to attempt to preach moral values and truths directly through talking about it, on the surface of the poem, rather than actually taking you there and making you feel it because it's beautiful. Now, Keats said, "Truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That is all you need to know that is all you know and all you need to know." But it's one thing to say that at the end of a poem in which Keats has demonstrated it in the most profound and beautiful and emotionally uplifting way. But this is not what the transcendentalists do. So Poe is waging a battle and says so, against what he believes is not just incorrect, wrong ideas, but ideas that are destructive of actually being able to develop the minds and the hearts and the souls of his fellow citizens. Now, this does not mean, however, that Poe considered any old thing that you wanted to just, throw on a page as a pretext for a poem was worthy of great poetry. Although he did show in the Poetic Principle that many subjects could be used and developed to arrive at this state of excitement of the soul, and the ability to demonstrate to the reader in a great poem by bringing them into this state of mind, make them intensely aware of their soul and of their immortality. He demonstrates it through a number of poems, some of which you scratch your head and say that's a weird topic for a poem, but he demonstrates even sometimes something horrible, even sometimes. But he said it almost always involves, and we'll see the importance of this later with his two of Poe's poems. It almost always involves a feeling of sadness, and I think what I just read you gives you an idea of why. It's the sadness, or better said, melancholy, that comes from the idea that we're mortal and can never fully attain that union with that immortal part of us in this life, except through great art. This is where I think this is where Poe really, other than I believe, other than Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, no one has stated, or Shelley in his defense of poetry, and Schiller in his aesthetic letters and other writings on the sublime, for example, is a wonderful work on this. But I think Poe is a little bit more transparent and clear and direct in making this point. And one of, I think, the greatest writers on this subject. Now, I think what I'll do at this point, since several of the things the thing I'm going to cite is a little bit long, but I want to preface this by actually giving you, without going through a detailed description of the argument or of the what Poe puts forward in the work, a little bit of its nature and a few of the points he makes, to give you a better appreciation when you hear the work, which is the Raven. He wrote the third of the things I talked about, the rationale of verse, and I just presented the essence of the Poetic Principle. The third one is the Philosophy of Composition essay. This involves a paradox that, for many people, a seeming paradox, because he wrote it to make absolutely clear and transparent how he wrote the Raven. Now, the Raven, Poe's most famous poem, almost all of us, at least my age, maybe into another generation after me, I don't know if it's even still taught in high school English, but we all had to read the Raven. It's probably the most one of the most recited, one of the most reprinted poems in the English language. It was extremely popular in Poe's time, so much so that he was called upon to recite it, in front of crowds of thousands of people. They began to call him the Raven. When he would go outside, little kids would follow him down the street, flapping their wings like a raven and going, "Nevermore, nevermore." And to which, by the way, he to his great delight. But it proves that the principles that he discusses in how he wrote this are, in fact, valid, because it did touch something in a very wide audience, and for the right reasons, not for what many times makes things popular. What he describes, so the paradox, of course, is here's a poem which has, as you'll see, as its subject matter and its mood and everything about it seems wildly imaginative, almost fantastical, but yet was written according to principles that are completely accessible to scientific rigor. And he goes through exactly how he did it. He describes first, he considered the mood and the effect, because he said the whole of poetry is the effect that it has on the soul. That's what leaves the impression. So he said, well, what is the thing that greatest affects us? He said it is this feeling of melancholy. And what is the greatest cause of this? It's death, obviously. That's the one thing we can't get around. And he said, but especially when it's that feeling of sadness at death is particularly uplifting when we're talking about the death of something beautiful, for exactly the reasons he points out in the Poetic Principle that I just read you. And what subject is more beautiful than the death, therefore, of a beautiful, loved woman? He said, therefore, that was going to be the subject of the poem. And he says, and then I'd considered what the length should be. And and then he says, well, he said, what's the most effective way to get across this effect? By repeated incantation of it so that it sinks into your psyche. Well, of course, that's known in poetry as a refrain, a repeated line or several lines at the close of every section of the poem, every stanza is called. So he says, I settled on the idea of a refrain. He said, I then betook myself to consider, well, what should be the sound predominant in that refrain? Well, the most sonorous and sad of sounds is the O sound, particularly when it's combined with R. So he said, it just immediately popped into my mind that the most sonorous and melancholy a word with that sound in it would be, of course, nevermore. For those of you who know the Raven, that's of course exactly what he does. And he said, but I have to have a pretext for presenting this word nevermore. And I didn't want it to be in the mouth of a human being, because that creates too many complications as to how the human being got there, why they're saying nevermore to this bereaved lover who's lost his loved one. So he said, I needed a non-human voice, and I didn't want it to be supernatural. So I decided on an animal, and he said, I thought of a parrot, but no, that wouldn't work, but a raven. It's black. It's considered in many cultures to be an omen of evil. And so he goes through methodically how he constructed the poem backwards. And he has a great deal to say about this. He says, great works of art, you will find in most cases, if their creators were honest about the process by which they created it, are conceived in this way. The idea, what in psychology is known as the preconscious idea, or what he's describing here as the effect. It's a definite effect, but it can't be summed up as a in a series of logical sentences. As I said before, if something can be better said in prose, it's the cold, logical language of prose that is best suited for that thing. What he's trying to get across here is a spiritual principle, and this pre-conscious idea associated with emotions, associated with, with elaborated imagery and everything with it. Though he starts with that and works backward to how he's going to do it, and he goes through, these methodical steps by which he came up with the idea of a refrain that would be from a raven. He then goes through why he chose the raven coming in through a window and landing on the bust of Pallas just above his chamber door. Then he sat down and wrote the climactic stanza, where the narrator, the bereaved lover, is at the height of his torture over this thing taunting him with the word nevermore. But he keeps asking questions, going, as you'll see during the poem, where he's almost wanting the bird to torture him. Poe observes that human beings have a strange desire to want to indulge themselves in the extreme of sorrow at such times, almost for its purgative, I suppose. He doesn't go on to describe it, but it's something you immediately recognize is true, and therefore what the narrator in the poem does is understandable. But that climactic turning point in the poem, after which is the denouement, where he winds it down and makes his closing statement, he composes that first and works backwards, rising in intensity to that point, to that climactic point. And I think this point about how great compositions are made is very true. We know from Mozart and Beethoven in particular, who Lyndon LaRouche, in his collaboration with the great Norbert Breining, explored in some depth this compositional method. It's known as thorough composition. There's an overarching idea that is a one that subsumes the many images, metaphors in music, the musical ironies that lead up to this overall, the discovery by the mind of the hearer of this overall idea, which is there in the mind of the composer from the beginning. And it's guiding. This is what this is known as motivic thorough composition, or motivic leading, is what Motivführung in German means, is motivic leading. I think this is exactly what Poe is describing in the method which he used to compose the Raven. And again, this is so at war with the common idea of what poetry is and how great creative works of art are composed, because we're led to believe in modern times that it's just, well, even in Poe's time, he's addressing this directly, and why he decided to write this piece, not the Raven, the philosophy of composition about how he wrote it, because the idea of the poet or the musician suddenly being seized by some mysterious idea that comes out of the ether and totally captures them, and they sit down and write, as if in a frenzy, like some like the Greek oracles or something. He says, nah, this is not how it's done. It's scientific, but it's based on a principle which can't be described by science, which is this spiritual principle, the immortality of the soul, and its ability to, its desire, not only its ability to perceive, but its desire to want to experience that. This is what poetry is about. So I think without further ado, unless Tony had something to add at this point, or explicate, or...
No, go ahead.
Okay, I think what I'll do is I'll just read the Raven. Now, Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dreamed before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then, what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, then with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute word, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl, to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he muttered, but a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Our friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled, and a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to thinking, to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking that this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl those fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall get press, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfume from some unseen censer swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, by God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, respite, and nepenthe from my memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted on this desert land enchanted, on this home of horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting, get thee back into the night, the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. So that is the Raven. Now, I don't know what this poem, what effect it has on you, but I would ask, does it not answer the thing that Poe talks about in the Poetic Principle? Because yes, it's it's dark, it's sad, it's melancholy, but the overall effect of it, I think, is this yearning of the soul for union with something eternal. In this case, it's love. It's the intense suffering that that loss creates, but it is. You'll see in the other thing I'm going to recite a little bit later on. I think the in a very strange way, is uplifting, because it is about something that's beyond the senses. It is something that touches the soul. And I'd like to hear, when we get to the dialogue section of our discussion, any thoughts or opinions people have about this. But this paradox that he created, this masterpiece, and you can hear, without seeing it written out, you can hear the incredible alliteration. That's the sound of consonants that are similar. The vowel assonance, that's similar vowel sounds combined to heighten the effect. The rhymes at the end of lines, the rhymes that go on inside the line. I mean, this is a masterpiece of versification, which is the art of actually writing the verse itself, which involves meter, rhythm, rhyme, etc. This is one of the great masterpieces of it. There are several other Poe poems which are similarly ingenious in that regard, but this overall effect is what I wanted to really convey. And it also demonstrates something that I think is extremely important, which is that poetry is never really about the subject matter on the subject matter on the surface. It always has this substratum or substrate, I guess you would say, of meaning that doesn't mean that it's inaccessible or vague or opaque. It simply means that it has an effect on you because of what Poe says about the human soul. That is the real subject of the poem, which the surface of it, the subject matter, is merely the pretext to be able to access, shall we say. And this assumption that Poe makes about human beings and the capacity for perceiving beauty and for the soul being able to be made aware of its existence and its immortality, this striving of the moth for the stars, he says in the Poetic Principle. It occurs to me that this is in itself an intensely Republican, if you will, with a small r, idea, because the mind tells us that something is true, the heart tells us that something is right or desirable, but the soul is what tells us about this principle that we're discussing here. And I think this is an inherently Republican idea, because this is certainly not what the enemies of Republic have been about. They are trying to convince people that they're nothing but machines. In the modern age, that's become the prevalent idea. The mind works by mechanical principles, and it can all be replicated by a machine ultimately. I mean, how many times have we seen this theme explored in modern so-called art? Or conversely, and it really comes down to the same thing, in my view, that we're just animals. We're slaves of our senses. We can know nothing but which the senses give us. And those great thinkers in history, whether it's Plato or Dante, in the modern period, Shakespeare, and some of the poets we've looked at, Shelley, Keats, Poe, Schiller, all believe that human beings are much more than that, and that when they're made aware that they're more than that, that they do have an immortal soul, and that is what's worth fighting for, not only for the sake of your own dignity, but for future generations. That securing the right to live a life as a true human being and not a slave of an oligarchy is that you love future generations. You love that in yourself and in your creator and in those human beings alive now and in the past, who bequeath these beautiful ideas to us, and also those in the future who you want to be able to experience that. That's the state of mind which great art, great poetry nurtures, strengthens, and sustains. And I think that is what Poe is aiming at in his poetry. This is what he was attempting to create a magazine. I think I mentioned this last week, was to be called The Stylus. It was the project he was working on when he died, when he was killed, where he would unite other artists, playwrights, poets, writers of prose, and I think visual art as well. He intended to have it very richly illustrated. That would be a quarterly publication to compete with the other quarterly publications at the time, particularly Blackwood's, which he made riotous fun of, and the Quarterly Review, both British publications, but were very influential in America. And Poe thought that this was just wrong, that we should have our own American culture, and that this would become its standard bearer. Never got off the ground, but he left us this legacy of these incredible poems, and and no one has been more, as I said, transparent in giving you a glimpse, as he says, behind the stage of the machinery by which the work is made. No one has done that as well, I think, as Poe. So should be very grateful to him for sharing this with us, and I hope our viewers will take advantage of these writings. They're wonderful. They're beautifully written, and involve the highest principles that we can concern ourselves with in art. So I think I'll close by reciting my favorite Poe poem, also very popular, very well known. It involves intense emotion, which I hope I can get through. But this, I think, in a different way, but to me, a much more explicitly uplifting way, gets at what we were just discussing. So without further ado, I'll just recite it, and then we can have some discussion. This is Annabel Lee. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not so happy, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, this was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that a wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. But the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in a sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Oh, with that, I think I'm finished. I know I've probably left much more darkness than light, but I hope it gives a little glimpse into Poe's poetic mind.